Chapter 161, Peeves' Adventure. Sagres was hurrying to class, clutching a thick copy of Introduction to Magic, when he turned a dark, armor-lined corner and froze at the scene before him. The dim corridor of Hogwarts had become the stage for a catastrophic cleaning show. Filch's prized automatic mop, rumored to have been magically tweaked by Kestrel, was dutifully doing its rounds. The metal joint where the handle met the mop head creaked as it pushed and pulled across the ancient stone floor, almost mechanical in its persistence. But its work produced anything but cleanliness. Each sweep left not water but a thick, winding ribbon of pitch-black ink. The ink crawled across the gray-white flagstones like ugly living vines, turning the solemn corridor into a crude abstract painting. The air smelled sharply of fresh ink. Sagres narrowed his eyes. He glanced around for the usually quick-to-appear Argus Filch. By now the caretaker would normally have rushed in furious, but the corridor was empty, save for the mop and the spreading vandalism. Experience told him this masterpiece wasn't an accident. He scanned the shadows and soon found the culprit. Near the arched ceiling, Peeves clutched his stomach with a triumphant grin, dangling from a stone seam. An empty ink bottle hung in his hand. A few drops of black liquid still fell from its mouth into the old iron bucket beside the mop. The not-so-bright enchanted mop had no idea the bucket now contained ink. It simply continued its programmed wet mop, unwittingly serving Peeves' mischief. Sagres rubbed his forehead. If Filch saw his beloved mop turning the corridor into this mess, he could already imagine the caretaker's face going purple and the roar that would follow. He'd also heard about the bronze feather gathering, when Peeves had trashed the Great Hall while both the professor and principal were away. The Weasley twins were still serving detention with Snape because of that. He couldn't let the poltergeist roam free. He needed to give Peeves something to do. His wand slid silently into his hand. Peeves? The word wasn't loud, but it carried a cold authority that cut through the mop's creaking. On the ceiling, Peeves' grin froze. He jerked, nearly dropping the bottle. Fear flickered across his erratic face, and he tried to slip back into a wall seam. Chaos storm! An invisible force seized him, yanking him out of the air. Peeves shrieked, flailing and attempting to phase through stone, but found himself bound as if in iron cords. His intangibility was useless. No! Let Peeves go! You can't! He wailed. Sagres ignored the panicked screeches. With a precise flick of his wand, he tilted the empty bottle so its mouth pointed at the compressed poltergeist. With a soft plop, as if capping a stopper, Peeves' struggling, frantic form was forced into the bottle he'd been using for mischief. Sagres traced several intricate runes on the glass. The bottle's mouth sealed with a thin, silvery patterned membrane. No matter how Peeves crashed and cursed inside, the bottle remained still, muffling him to dull thuds. Quiet. Sagres' voice was flat as he shook the bottle like an unwelcome trinket. Enjoy Hogwarts Castle a bit more. Tomorrow, you might be embarking on a long journey. Research into chaotic entities like poltergeists has always been scant in the wizarding world. Sagres had once found several dusty, hand-scribbled research notes in a corner of the restricted section. Most of them described phenomena without probing essence or remedies, except for one, the work of Lyle Lupin. Lupin was one of the few who had studied atypical magical beings such as poltergeists and boggarts at length. From their brief correspondence, Sagres knew Lupin had once worked in the Department of Anomalous Phenomena in the Department of Mysteries before resigning under unclear pressure. Poltergeists available for study were almost non-existent. Peeves was practically a unique, ancient specimen. Sagres had adapted the suppression magic he used on Peeves from Lupin's notes. He'd studied Lupin's hypotheses, admired their rigor, and believed that instead of letting this engine of chaos continue to run amok, it might serve a more useful purpose, becoming a rare experimental subject. At that moment, heavy footsteps and labored breathing came from the far end of the corridor. Who's vandalizing my corridor? Argus Filch's wrinkled, gloomy face rounded the corner. His bulbous eyes locked on the winding ink stains and then snapped to the automatic mop, still tirelessly laying down fresh lines. My mop, my corridor. Filch's sallow face flushed to a terrifying brownish purple. His scrawny chest heaved. He looked about to explode. Then his fury stalled when he took in the full scene. The young professor standing calmly amid the ink-strewn mess, a bottle clutched in his hand with something moving, or rather, banging, inside. Filch's gaze flicked from Sagres to the bottle, to the mop and the ruined floor. Anger gave way to a tangled, almost wordless expression. He probably understood what had happened, but Sagres' calmness felt like an insult to the squib caretaker. "Greengrass, Professor?" Filch croaked. What's going on? Peeves, he? Evidently. Sagres' tone was emotionless as he lifted the bottle so Filch could see Peeves pounding at the glass. Peeves performed a small functional upgrade on your able assistant. Filch stared at Sagres' composed, in-control demeanor, then at his mop and his ruined corridor. Rage surged again, but it was mixed with an inability to lash out. He glared at the bottle as if he wanted to snatch Peeves out and punish him personally, yet he didn't move, constrained by both apprehension and the presence of the young professor. 162. Medical Miracles, Cleaning Charm. Sagres waved his wand. A soft blue glow washed the grimy corridor clean. Even the thick ink caked in the mop head vanished, leaving it with its original, worn but clean cloth strips. The mop paused, as if confused by the sudden disappearance of water, then instinctively tried to dip into the iron bucket where the ink had been. "I suggest you check your mop, Mr. Filch. Its magic sensing seems to be completely out of order. Professor Lumina's modifications are clearly not perfect." The remark was brief, offering no repair advice. "I'll deal with this blasted mop," Filch snapped, gritting his teeth. He kicked the still complaining mechanical mop. The metal joint squealed and the device collapsed, finally going still. Sagres watched with the same indifferent air he always wore, as if Filch's reaction were exactly what he'd expected. He gave a slight, elegant nod. "Then I'll be going, Mr. Filch. I have class." When Sagres tucked his books under his arm and stepped into the classroom, it was already full. Since that duel, his lessons had swelled in popularity. Many students had petitioned their deans for permission to attend. He was unmoved. When the deans handed him the long list of applicants, he approved them all without looking. Whether these students sought genuine knowledge or simply a spectacle was irrelevant to him. One sheep or a dozen were the same. Besides, he never gave homework. He glanced over the crowd. Ginny Weasley sat with Astoria Greengrass. Luna Lovegood, still a first year, watched dreamily. Neville Longbottom, a second year, sat where he always did. Even Draco Malfoy was behaving himself, and Goyle squeezed into the back row. "Professor, is that ink bottle in your hand? Does it contain Peeves?" Penelope Clearwater raised her hand. Sagres did not hide it. He nodded and passed the ink bottle down the row. "Say goodbye to him. You probably won't see Peeves for a long time." "Really?" The class brightened. No one seemed particularly upset at Peeves' absence. If anything, they were glad, most of them at least. "Probably," Sagres said without looking up, opening his textbook. "He's assisting a researcher on a study of poltergeist ecology." The students passed the bottle around with glee, shaking it and watching Peeves grimace and batter the glass in vain. After a while, Sagres took it back, set it on the podium, and began the lesson. Halfway through, the classroom door eased open. Professor McGonagall stood in the doorway, her expression severe. "Excuse me, Sagres?" Her eyes fixed on a boy in the back row. Sagres raised an eyebrow, inviting her to continue. "Mr. Longbottom," McGonagall said with an urgency that cut through the lesson, "please come with me." Neville's face drained color. He hurried to gather his books. Harry, Ron, and Hermione watched him with obvious concern. Sagres inclined his head, granting permission. Neville almost stumbled as he left. The instant the door shut, a buzz of whispers swelled through the room. Quiet. That single word fell like cold water. The chatter died, the same ironclad hush that always settled when Sagres was in command. The students refocused, and the lesson resumed. The next morning, returning to his sparsely furnished office from the library, Sagres found the Daily Prophet newly laid on his desk. Its headline sprawled across the front page. Medical Miracle. St. Mungo's solves permanent damage from the Cruciatus Curse. 21 people, including the Longbottoms, regain consciousness. Beneath the headline, a photograph showed a bright ward at St. Mungo's. Frank and Alice Longbottom, Aurors once driven mad by Death Eater torture, sat side by side looking pale, but no longer vacant. They gripped each other's hands. Weak smiles hovered on their faces. Neville stood between them, dabbing at his eyes, his mouth trying for a smile. The article explained that Mirabella Rolson, a senior healer at St. Four Mungo's, after years of research, had reconstructed an ancient soul-mending magic and managed to reverse forms of mental damage previously thought irreversible. The Longbottoms were among the first to receive the treatment and had shown remarkable improvement. The final paragraph carried the careful hedging of official statements. Given the epoch-making importance of Rolson's work and the blessing it offers to victims of the dark arts, ministry officials indicated she was likely to be nominated for an honor and expected to receive an Order of Merlin, rank to be decided. Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge would make a formal statement on Thursday. Sargeras's eyes lingered on the mention of the Order of Merlin. His fingers tapped lightly on the mahogany desk, a soft staccato. He had not realized Neville's parents had been treated at St. Mungo's. There was no show of triumph on his face, only a quietly contained satisfaction that this particular child, always awkward but hardy, had reached a bright turning point. As for the Order of Merlin, the pomp and ceremony that would likely follow, the idea drew a faint, ironic curl at the corner of his mouth. He took a sip of the cold tea at his elbow and grimaced at the bitterness. He pushed the paper aside and pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward him. He wrote, "For Mr. Lyle Lupin. Mr. Lupin, I hope this letter finds you well. Enclosed is a special package containing Hogwarts resident troublemaker, Peeves. Perhaps he has had an epiphany and wishes to contribute to poltergeist studies, or perhaps he simply wants to leave the castle for a time. At the request of Hogwarts staff, students, and ghosts, I have decided to send him away temporarily. Your previous research into the nature of poltergeists impressed me, particularly your theory about their energy cores and the anchors that tie them to locations. I believe Peeves, as a live specimen, may provide useful practical data for your unfinished work. Please observe him at your discretion, and I hope his sacrifice will not be in vain. Important, I have temporarily sealed the bottle. Once the cap is removed, the binding between Peeves and Hogwarts will immediately reactivate and will pull him back to the castle. Please limit your methods to non-invasive observation if you do not wish him to return at once. Sincerely, Sagres Greengrass, Office of Advanced Charm Theory and Practice." He folded the letter, placed it with the ink bottle into a small parcel, and summoned Loctus. After sending the raven on its way, Sagres prepared to find Professor McGonagall. She had seen him imprison Peeves in the bottle the day before. As deputy headmistress and steward of the school's accounts, she should be informed. After all, Peeves was, by all rights, part of the school's property. Chapter 163, The Accusation. The deputy headmistress's office felt oppressively tense. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been summoned there by Professor McGonagall. When they entered and saw that, in addition to McGonagall, Professor Snape stood behind his desk like a thundercloud, and Pansy Parkinson lingered behind him with bloodshot eyes and a hollow, resentful look, the three students felt their stomachs drop. "Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger," McGonagall said in her usual stern tone, though there was a faint undercurrent of concern. "Miss Parkinson has brought a serious complaint to her head of house, Professor Snape. She claims that for the past 3 nights she has been tormented by some kind of malicious spell and has been unable to sleep. She believes this stems from an encounter in the corridor 3 nights ago involving the 3 of you." Her sharp gaze swept across them. "She accuses Miss Granger of casting an illegal charm." Snape's mouth was a hard line, his dark eyes, as inscrutable as ever, fixed on Hermione. "Miss Parkinson has described her symptoms clearly: relentless, irresistible wakefulness, near a breakdown. This is a rather particular set of symptoms. Miss Granger, do you have anything to say in your defense? Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, were you aware of anything?" Pansy stood behind him, trying to pull herself upright, but the dark circles under her eyes and a slight tremor betrayed how unwell she was. She glowered at Hermione, her lips moving soundlessly. Hermione drew a breath to answer when the heavy oak door eased open again. A tall man entered, Professor Sagres, still composed, his dark gray robes immaculate. He glanced calmly around the room, pausing when his gaze fell on Snape and Pansy. The brief crease between his brows was almost imperceptible as he said, "Good morning. It seems there's some sort of inquiry underway." He leaned casually against the doorframe, eyes sweeping over the three students and lingering on Pansy. Snape's expression hardened. "This is a matter between Slytherin and Gryffindor students. It's no concern of yours, Professor Sagres." "Oh." Sagres drew the word out, then turned his cool gaze to the haggard Pansy. "Miss Parkinson does look unwell." There was no real sympathy in his voice. "Professor McGonagall, what exactly is being alleged? That Miss Granger cursed her? When? Where? What evidence do you have?" Snape snorted. "Miss Parkinson's testimony is evidence." "I disagree, Professor." Sagres's reply was calm. "A single-side statement cannot stand alone as proof, especially when I, myself, suffered through something similar during my time at school." Pansy went paler and shot a pleading look at Snape. He only scowled. "Sagres, are you calling my judgment into question?" "I am asking for fairness and for an intact chain of evidence, Professor Snape." Sagres's voice remained steady as he regarded the young wizards and witch. "Without clear proof, punishing one student on another's accusation alone is unjust and invites false charges." McGonagall's severe expression softened a fraction. She cleared her throat. "Professor Sagres is right. Accusations must be supported by evidence, Severus." Snape's face darkened. He reached into his robes and produced a small brown glass vial. "If you want evidence," he said, a grim smile tugging at his lips, "let Granger be tested." He held the vial up. "Powerful veritaserum. 3 drops and every truth spills out." "I absolutely forbid it," McGonagall snapped. "I will not allow you to use veritaserum on a student, Severus." Sagres glanced at Hermione, then at Pansy, as if he had just considered a thought. A cold smile touched his mouth. "If both sides cling to their stories and memory is at issue, I have a suggestion that will resolve this quickly." He turned to Pansy, his gaze incisive. "Miss Parkinson, if you wish to prove your accusation or to clear Miss Granger's name, would you consent to a memory screening? I can extract the memory fragments of that encounter for everyone to inspect. The truth will be plain to see." "No," Pansy shrieked, recoiling so violently she almost stumbled. Terror contorted her face. "No, absolutely not!" Her outburst drew a sharp look from Snape and made McGonagall's eyes grow particularly keen. Harry and Ron exchanged glances, barely suppressing snickers. Both understood why Pansy panicked. She was terrified of what might be revealed. Sagres tilted his head slightly, as if Pansy's refusal confirmed his suspicions. "It seems Miss Parkinson has reservations about revealing the truth. Perhaps there are aspects of her conduct during that confrontation she would prefer not to be made public." There was a thread of mockery in his voice. Snape's jaw tightened. Disgust and anger flickered across his face. "You are defending her." "Am I?" Sagres said evenly. "Or are you?" Silence fell. The delicate strands of legitimacy had already skimmed Pansy's mind, and Sagres, of course, knew what lay there. McGonagall stepped in at once, regaining her customary authority. "Professor Sagres is right. Without conclusive evidence, we cannot punish a student on mere supposition." "And Pansy's insomnia?" Snape snapped, glaring at Pansy now that he probably understood what had happened. "That is Madame Pomfrey's domain." McGonagall pursed her lips. "Or perhaps a draught of living death. Or a stupefy would do the trick," Sagres cut in wryly. Pansy went ashen at the suggestion. Sagres held a particular dislike for those who hounded others without the courage to act decisively. It reminded him of some of his former classmates he had treated for free. Snape's face turned livid. "Let's go," he barked. Pansy looked from Snape to McGonagall, then shot one last resentful glance at the 3 Gryffindors and at Sagres's impassive face. Tears, fury, and exhaustion warred in her expression. In the end, she could only follow Snape out. "Very well, this matter is concluded," McGonagall declared. "Potter, Weasley, Granger, you may go, and be careful, avoid further conflicts." Her last words carried an unmistakable warning. The 3 of them bowed as if pardoned and turned to leave, relief visible on their faces. Before they reached the door, however, it opened again. Neville entered with his formidable grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, an imposing witch in a green robe, her pointed hat topped with a stuffed vulture. McGonagall greeted them immediately. "Madame Longbottom, Neville, please come in." Harry, Ron, and Hermione brightened at the sight of Neville. "Neville, we read the paper. How are your aunt and uncle?" they blurted. Madame Longbottom addressed them in a brisk but polite tone, and Neville, flushed and embarrassed, ducked his head. Chapter 164, Neville's inferiority complex. Neville told me about all of you. You helped him through so much. Very good children, Madame Longbottom said, smiling with approval. The three of them returned her smile, a little embarrassed. Minerva, she said loudly to Professor McGonagall, I brought Neville back. Thanks to the healers at St. Mungo's, Frank and Alice have finally recovered their minds. The mention of her son and daughter-in-law made a rare tremor enter Madame Longbottom's booming voice, quickly giving way to pride. Professor McGonagall's face softened with relief. That is wonderful news, Augusta. I'm truly happy for Frank and Alice. Her expression then eased as she looked at Neville. But Madame Longbottom's next words struck him like a bucket of cold water. Yes, it's fortunate, she said, puffing up her chest. Her gaze turned sharp and reproachful. It's a pity Neville didn't inherit their talent, and I need to speak to this boy. She jabbed his arm with her cane. Your grandmother thinks you're wrong. Neville's face flushed crimson. He felt the confused, concerned looks from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and the calm, searching stare of Professor Greengrass. He lowered his head and stared at the tips of his shoes. Frank and Alice, my son and daughter-in-law, Madame Longbottom's voice echoed in the quiet office, are very talented aurors. They are heroes. They were tortured into madness by Death Eaters while resisting the Dark Lord to protect everyone. Their experience is a medal and an honor, not something to be hidden away in shame. And you, Neville, her voice hardened. You've never told your friends the truth about your parents, have you? Are you ashamed of having parents who lost their health and sanity? Neville shook his head, miserable. The three friends looked at him and felt a helpless sort of sorrow. None of them knew how to lift what weighed him down. I've never been ashamed of their illness, Neville said weakly, still staring at the floor. Never. Then why have you never spoken of them to your friends? Madame Longbottom pressed. Silence settled. After a long moment, Neville drew a shaky breath and, voice breaking, said, I just felt maybe I was the shame. His words came out low, as if he'd used all his strength. You're right, Grandma. My memory isn't good. My magic's poor. My grades are a mess. I don't have any of their brilliance. Madame Longbottom opened her mouth to retort, but Neville went on, the confession tumbling out. They're heroes. And I'm pathetic, almost a squib. Oh no, don't say that, Neville, Hermione said immediately, distressed. You're not a squib, Ron nodded gravely. You learn things quickly in Professor Greengrass's class, don't you? I'll think of the good. Your aunt and uncle are all right now, Harry added sincerely, though he felt a tug of frustration at Neville's pain. They crowded around him, offering comfort and awkward attempts at cheer, trying to lift the gloom that clung to him. Madame Longbottom watched for a moment, then looked down at her cane and sighed. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat. Her voice softened. Augusta, Neville may not be as bad as you think. From what I know, his herbology grades are very good. Pomona speaks highly of him. She stepped closer and gently patted Neville's tense shoulder. Welcome back, Neville. I imagine your friends are very glad to see you. The touch eased something in Neville. His shoulders loosened fractionally. He still wouldn't meet his grandmother's eyes, but the crushing weight that had been squeezing him lifted a little, helped by having finally said what had been buried in his chest and by Professor McGonagall's words. The conversation about his parents wasn't over, but at least, in this small office, he had spoken the deepest thing on his mind, and most importantly, his parents were cured. That had to be the happiest thing of all. Sagres, who had been watching quietly, stood up and broke the silence. Professor McGonagall, I came to tell you that Peeves might be leaving Hogwarts for a while, but don't worry, he'll be back in time. Leaving? That's actually a relief, Professor McGonagall said with an uncharacteristic smile. Sagres stopped then, nodding calmly. It seems to please you. He turned to the four young wizards. Then, Mr. Longbottom, and you three. The young wizards looked at him. It's time to return to class. He bowed slightly to Madame Longbottom. It was a pleasure to see you, madam. Then he motioned for Harry, Ron, Hermione, and a still dazed Neville to follow him out. They walked down the corridor in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Sagres' steady gaze lingered on Neville's bewildered face. Finally, he broke the quiet. Mr. Longbottom, he said in a calm, measured voice that somehow steadied the listener, do you think you're talentless? Neville looked up as if pulled from a fog. Shame and surprise mingled on his face. Yes, Professor Greengrass. I always seem to make a mess of things. Professor Snape said my potions ability is almost 0, and my transfiguration is poor." He trailed off. Sagres nodded, then let his fingers tap Neville's wand pouch. The wand slid into his hand, as if by habit. "Talent," he said, rolling the word over his tongue, "is an overrated word." The 4 students blinked, uncertain where he was going. Sagres continued evenly. "People think of talent as a spark, some innate miracle, but that's a misconception. This wand, just a piece of wood with a core, has no will, no power of its own. It's a tool, a conduit." Neville opened his mouth, but no sound came. Sagres did not expect an answer. He went on, matter-of-factly. "Failing potions, spells misfiring, those are failures of technique or understanding. They can be practiced and corrected. They're not evidence that you lack talent." He smiled faintly, as if recollecting something. "Magic, at its heart, is a power of the mind. It does not flow only in blood. It is rooted in belief." "Belief?" Neville echoed, stunned. Sagres nodded. "Are you resolute enough to believe it exists? Clear enough to see the direction it should flow? Pure enough to shape it into reality? That is the essence of magic, the crystallization of mental focus." He spread his hand as if holding something invisible. "So, Mr. Longbottom, talent is a misleading measure. Rather than ask whether you were born with it, ask what's in your heart." He glanced at the wand and then, with calm certainty, handed it back to Neville. "Get a new wand. A wand with unicorn hair wishes to be true to one master only. Holding on to it while you doubt yourself will only hold you back." There was no false warmth in his eyes, only a cool clarity that cut through confusion like moonlight. Neville watched Sagres walk away, then looked down at the wand in his hand, feeling the words reverberate in him. Chapter 165, A Sudden Challenge. "What do you mean, Neville?" Ron turned, brown eyes full of confusion. "Why does Professor Greengrass want you to change wands? That one looks perfectly fine." Neville didn't answer right away. He lowered his head and stared at the wand cradled in his hand. The wood had the worn sheen of long use, and the shaft bore a few subtle but deep scratches. He traced those marks with his fingertip, as if they could conjure up some distant, blurry memory. After a long moment, he looked up, voice low and hesitant. "Because this is my father's wand." He stopped, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I used to think, when I held it, I could be as brave as him. It reminded me." His voice trailed off to a nearly inaudible sigh. "I thought it made me stronger. I was wrong." "No wonder," Hermione cried, her eyes widening. "No wonder your charms work have been so inconsistent. That wand might be holding you back." She remembered the day she'd gone to buy her own wand and what Mr. Ollivander had told her. "A wand chooses the wizard, not the other way around," she said. "Using your father's wand is like trying to run in shoes that don't fit." "He told me that too." Harry nodded. "The wand chooses the wizard." Neville stayed quiet, thumb absently rubbing a familiar indentation at the end of the wand. Hermione's words pricked at the corner of his heart. He remembered 2 years ago, in the dim, crowded room at Ollivander's, his grandmother insisting on buying him a new wand, and him stubbornly refusing for the first time in his life. He'd clung to his father's old wand as if it were the last link to his parents in that hospital bed, as if it proved he could be brave. In the end, Mrs. Augusta Longbottom, strict as ever, had seen the stubbornness in her grandson and, uncharacteristically, given in. She allowed him to inherit the wand. Professor Greengrass's suggestion had hit him like a bucket of cold water. "Give it back to your father," Harry said softly, breaking the silence. His green eyes were full of concern. "He's at St. Mungo's now, isn't he? Go to Mr. Ollivander and get a wand that's yours." He patted Neville's arm, trying for a lighter tone. "Ron just got his." "That's right." Ron straightened, eager to be helpful. He drew his new wand from an inner pocket. "Look, Willow, 14 inches, unicorn hair core. It's so much better than that broken stick I had before." He flicked it once and it whistled through the air. "You should go try it, Neville. Ollivander always has one that fits." They hadn't finished speaking when something blocked the corridor. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville looked up. The easy mood vanished. Draco Malfoy stood there, wearing a black traveling robe with the Slytherin crest faintly visible at the cuffs. His platinum hair fell more naturally than usual, not precisely combed, and his expression was different too. Less sneer, more icy focus. His gaze was sharper, colder. Behind him loomed Gregory Goyle, hulking as ever, but even Goyle's blank-faced ferocity had a new, forced seriousness to it, as if he were trying to mirror Malfoy. Malfoy's eyes swept over the four of them and finally settled on Harry. No mocking smile, no taunting opening, just a brief, practiced nod. "Potter," he said, his voice steady and cool. "Longbottom. Weasley. Granger," Harry replied cautiously. "Malfoy, what do you want? Trying to get justice for Parkinson?" Malfoy ignored the barb and took a small step forward, keeping a respectful distance. Goyle stayed close behind. "Their affairs are none of mine," he said, glancing at Neville's wand with a quick, appraising look. No ridicule, just interest. "Ollivander's choice is important." That seemed like all the preamble Malfoy wanted. He cut to the point. "I'm not here to cause trouble, at least not the sort you usually mean. I'm here to issue a formal challenge, Potter." "A challenge?" Ron snorted. "What trick are you pulling now? Want us to accidentally get caught in the trophy room again?" Malfoy's eyes swept coldly over Ron, and the comment died in Ron's throat. "Weasley, your imagination remains spectacularly barren." Malfoy sounded almost bored. Then, addressing Harry, he continued, "A duel. In public, supervised by a professor or prefect." Harry frowned. "You want to duel me? Why?" "Why?" Malfoy lifted his chin with a hint of pride. "To improve my dueling ranking." He spoke crisply, unembarrassed. "I've heard your Expelliarmus is very effective. You'd make a worthy opponent." "Valuable opponent," Hermione said, skeptical. "So you're after Harry, then?" "Of course." Malfoy fixed Harry with a cool stare. "Isn't he the strongest of the Gryffindor second years? Beating him would earn points and recognition. Entirely reasonable." "Oh, really?" Ron couldn't resist. "Then why bring Goyle? For encouragement? Or are you planning to hand you props when no one is looking?" Malfoy didn't rise to the bait. He simply motioned to Goyle. The usually silent boy spoke in a deep, clumsy voice as if reciting something he had been drilled on. "Draco has defeated all the second-year Slytherins." The corridor fell quiet. The four exchanged looks, disbelief written across their faces. Harry studied Malfoy's calm gray eyes and felt suddenly how different this Malfoy was. Still, he kept his voice slow and even. "A formal duel?" "Yes." Malfoy inclined his head. "You set the time and place and choose the supervisor. Follow standard dueling procedure. I accept any reasonable terms." He paused then, and for the first time a trace of the old mockery crept back into his tone. "Of course, Potter, provided you accept. Or are you afraid?" Chapter 166, Approaching the End of Term. Harry didn't answer at once. He looked at Malfoy, who now seemed almost reborn, then at his friends, reading the different expressions on their faces, and finally nodded slowly. "All right," he said calmly. "I accept." Ron's mouth had opened to argue, and Hermione's brow was knit. Both clearly had things to say. Harry waved them off, cutting through their unspoken objections, and added, "But I appoint Professor Greengrass's raven as the witness." "No problem," Malfoy replied, quickly and decisively, "though the professor may only send his raven to do it." "That's fine," Harry answered. Seeing no need to press, Malfoy gave a quick nod, turned, and left with Goyle. The four of them were left standing in the corridor, looking at each other. "Harry, you shouldn't have agreed to him," Hermione said, anxious and angry. "Malfoy is acting far too strange. I half think he's someone who drank Polyjuice Potion and is impersonating him." "Polyjuice Potion?" Harry and Ron looked bewildered, almost in unison. Neville blinked too, equally unfamiliar. Hermione spun on them, her worry snapping into disbelief, and then into outrage. "Polyjuice Potion. Snape said in Potions that it can temporarily change the drinker's appearance. What are you two doing in Potions class if you're not listening?" "Oh, Hermione." Ron shrank back and grumbled. "Besides listening to Snape, isn't there anything else to do in Potions?" Hermione shot him a glare so fierce he seemed to shrink. Harry opened his mouth to chime in with Ron's defense, but Hermione's look stopped him mid-sentence. He swallowed his words and cleared his throat instead. "Ahem. Hermione, Malfoy is suspicious, yes, but with Greengrass's raven as witness, he shouldn't be able to pull any tricks." He rubbed his wand holster absently. "Besides, he has restrained himself a lot since Greengrass gave him detention." "How do you know it's not a disguise?" Hermione pressed. "Maybe this whole reformed act is just to trick us. He said he'd beaten all the Slytherin second years, including Crabbe and Goyle. Where's Crabbe? Why wasn't he with Malfoy today? That's strange in itself. But I've already agreed, Harry said, spreading his hands in helplessness, though his eyes were steady. Neville, suddenly thoughtful, murmured, I heard that raven is the professor's eyes. If it comes, Malfoy shouldn't dare to cheat, right? As the term neared its end, the shadow of exams fell over Hogwarts. Students buried themselves in books and parchment, doing final reviews. Yet amid the stress, a small piece of news slipped through. Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy, two of the best second years in Gryffindor and Slytherin, were scheduled to duel in a week. Days passed with tense study breaks, punctuated by the occasional lighter story. Someone had tried a spell to smooth a pimple and accidentally erased his nose. Madame Pomfrey, with her miraculous remedies, managed to put it back. Professor Lumina had reportedly modified a mop for Filch again. This time, people hoped, without mishap. Hagrid, astonishingly, appeared clean-shaven and neatly combed, dressed in a well-fitting suit that made his already huge frame look even more imposing. Students were too busy with exams to dig into any of Hagrid's oddities. Duel Day twilight washed the ancient stone walls of Hogwarts in a shallow gold. On the raised dueling platform, Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy faced each other. Lower-year students who had rushed to see the match lined the sides. Gryffindor's scarlet and gold packed one side, Slytherin's silver and green the other. Ron and Hermione stood together near the front of the Gryffindor section. Ron swallowed hard, fists clenched. Hermione's eyes, however, were fixed not on the combatants, but on the tall bronze lamppost at the platform's edge, where Loctis sat like a statue, his black head turned, calm and impassive, watching the field. In theory, a platform duel needed no extra witness, but for absolute certainty, they had invited this particular overseer. There was no teacher to call the duel or read rules. When the raven's head tilted and fixed its gaze on the center of the platform, a hush fell over the crowd. The stone slab underfoot sank into the ground, low walls rose up, and the duel began. Malfoy moved instantly, wand snapping up in a smooth, practiced motion. Stupefy! A red bolt screamed toward Harry's chest, an impeccably executed stupefy, faster and more precise than usual. Harry reacted the moment Malfoy's wand moved. He sidestepped and slid, sending his wand in a quick diagonal arc. Protego! An invisible barrier barely formed before the bolt hit it. The spell struck the edge of his shield charm in a glittering explosion, the impact rocking Harry a little. Leglocker Curse! Levicorpus! Spells came from Malfoy in a rapid chain. Harry ducked and rolled. The curses skimmed over his scalp and struck the air behind him. Rolling to his feet, he flicked his wand with a backhand and sent a white jet of Petrificus Talus for Malfoy's head. Malfoy didn't dodge. He planted his feet and drove his wand down. An impedimenta of wind rose up like a wall. Harry's Petrificus struck it and only made a faint ripple. Their offense and defense traded back and forth, dizzyingly fast. Malfoy's spellwork was polished and precise, every motion honed, evidence of private training with Snape after his father had arranged lessons. He no longer relied on petty tricks so much as combinations of spells designed to overwhelm and suppress. Harry's approach was different, unpredictable, angled, improvisational. He lacked Malfoy's rigid discipline, but he made up for it with agility and keen instincts, the same quickness that made him an excellent seeker. He rolled, slid, used the low walls for cover, and turned simple shield charms and obstructive jinxes into defensive art. Time and again, he deflected Malfoy's fierce attacks, his reactions razor-sharp. Spellfire stitched the platform with dancing lights and bursts of sparks. The crowd watched, rapt. Gryffindors roared approval at every one of Harry's dodges and counters, while the Slytherins, though excited, cheered more quietly. Chapter 167. Defeat Hermione bit her lower lip, nerves taut as she watched a faint silver flash at the tip of Malfoy's wand. Ron, too, sounded surprised. "Is that really Malfoy?" he muttered. They hadn't been idle. Given nearly twice the practice time, and under Hermione's near-drill sergeant supervision, the two of them had improved fast. Could Professor Greengrass have taught Malfoy those spells as well? On the dueling platform, Malfoy's curses came in a steady rain. Harry moved, dodging left and right with a calm economy of motion. He didn't cast often, but when he did, it was precise, sometimes even countering and forcing Malfoy into a flurry. When Malfoy tried to pin Harry with a binding spell as Harry retreated, the opponent's wand came up for a fraction of a second. Harry seized that opening. He didn't reach for anything ornate, just the simplest, most reliable spell, swift and clean. Expelliarmus! A shaft of concentrated red light shot out and slipped exactly through the gap in Malfoy's spell, ignoring the boy's hasty defensive movements. There was a sharp crack, as if a giant hand had struck him. Malfoy's wand flew from his fingers, arced high through the air, and thudded into the dust at the edge of the platform. The arena fell utterly silent. Malfoy froze, his right hand still posed from the interrupted spell, but his palm was empty. The hard, icy look on his face snapped like a mask and revealed something raw beneath. Shock. Loss. A ripple of whispers began to climb from the stands. Sweat matted his platinum hair to his forehead. His gray eyes stayed fixed on his wand as if it had betrayed him. A raven perched on a lamppost tilted its head, scanning the crowd with dark eyes, then let out a short, hoarse caw and flew off. There was no applause. Gryffindor's side burst into a long suppressed cheer and chatter. The Slytherin table was wrapped in dull silence and low, guarded murmurs. Malfoy drew a steadying breath. He did not shout or make excuses as he might once have done. He didn't even look back at Harry. He walked off the platform with heavy steps and went straight to his wand. Bent under everybody's gaze, he picked it up, dusted it carefully with a silk handkerchief, and tucked it back into the inner pocket of his robes. When he straightened, his face had closed again into a practiced calm. He scanned the Slytherin crowd with a cold, sharp look. Voices stabbed at him immediately. "Oh, Draco, seems Potter's got a bit of luck, doesn't he?" Someone sneered. Daphne's friend drawled. "Or did Professor Greengrass's detention blunt your edge?" The girls nearby snickered. An older boy, arms folded, spoke with contempt. "Chasing dueling ranks? Waste of time. Pure blood glory. That's what matters, Draco. Spend your energy on things that actually count, not prancing about like a stupid lion." "Exactly. Now everyone will think Slytherin's no better than Gryffindor," another muttered, laced with resentment. Their words reached him like buzzing gnats. Once, he would have retorted, striking back with barbed, cutting remarks. Now, there was no flare of anger in his gray eyes, only a depthless coldness and detachment. He kept walking, offering a single, disdainful glance to the voices as if they were nothing but trash. The fragile hope of camaraderie with his classmates died then and there. Beyond that tattered claim to lineage, what did they really have? Stupid, arrogant leeches riding on ancestral fame, he thought, disgusted and suddenly resolute. Their mockery no longer mattered. Their buzzing could not penetrate him. With Goyle shadowing him like a living barrier, Malfoy cut through the crowd and across the ivy bridge to the Slytherin common room. When the heavy stone slid shut behind them, the noise and malice were finally muffled. He leaned against the cold wall of the dungeon and took a long, damp breath. Losing to Potter left a bad taste, but what felt far worse was the stale, complacent arrogance in the stands. He looked at Goyle, silent and solid beside him, then at the empty armchair in the corner that had once belonged to Crabbe. Loneliness welled up with an intensity he hadn't expected. Right after that came something fiercer, a burning hunger for power. He clenched the wand inside his pocket. Its coolness was a reminder of tonight's lesson. He didn't need these pure-blood friends who only knew how to sneer. He needed power, real strength that would force everyone to acknowledge him, strength like Professor Greengrass's. Without hesitation, he turned toward the stone staircase leading to the boys' dormitory. "Training's canceled tonight," he said without looking back. "Study instead, Goyle. Final exams are coming." It had been a long time since he'd been home. His mother still sent sweets by owl every week, but he hadn't touched one. In the quiet of the dormitory, he pulled open a drawer, took out a candy wrapped in bright red paper, peeled it open, and popped it into his mouth. The familiar sweetness spread across his tongue, and for a moment he missed the warm fireside at Malfoy Manor. The questions that had kept him up, the chamber of secrets, the whispering accusations, felt less sharp now. Father had made a mistake, perhaps more than one, but Malfoy could not believe his father would ever willingly harm his own son. He was certain of that. Chapter 168, Kestrel Goes Offline. The air of final exams settled over Hogwarts like an invisible pressure. The library was packed. Common rooms stayed lit until dawn. Young witches and wizards clutched thick textbooks and parchment, dark circles under their eyes, muttering to themselves as if they could cram knowledge into their smoking brains. Cumbersome charms, tricky transfiguration practicals, complex potions formulas, and the dry goblin rebellion timelines of history of magic. Each subject was enough to send anyone into a spin. Just as everyone was at their most frantic, a piece of news as ridiculous as a dung bomb burst across the school. Professor Lumina of Defense Against the Dark Arts had been admitted to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. The reason was another entry in the unlucky legend of the Defense Against the Dark Arts post. Reportedly, to help her students calm their nerves before exams, Professor Lumina, known to many as Kestrel, decided to brew a soothing draught in her office. She went in humming off-key, everything prepared with practiced ease. It wasn't a complicated potion. The ingredients were ready, and the mixture soon turned a reassuring pale blue, giving off a fresh mint and chamomile scent. Kestrel was pleased. She felt inspired. Perhaps a touch of luck, she mused. She spotted a small golden bottle of Felix Felicis on a shelf, a precious vial Nightingale had given her. On impulse, or perhaps because she felt she was in such good form, she drew just a single drop with the finest glass dropper. Just a tiny bit, to add a dash of luck to this calming potion, so the youngsters might get a flash of inspiration in their exams, she told herself. She was proud of the idea. With a flick of her wrist, the sparkling gold fell into the pale blue potion. The expected scene of gold and blue merging in a warm glow never happened, but there was a reaction, only not the one she'd imagined. The potion began to churn violently, its color turning murky black and its texture growing thick. A foul stench erupted, putrid, sulfurous like rotten fruit and something dead, a combination of everything she hated. "It stinks!" Kestrel exclaimed. Her nose was nearly over the bottle when the smell hit her. It felt as if an invisible hand of misfortune clutched her throat. Everything went black. In the space of a few seconds, the bottle exploded. The black liquid soaked her head and face. When she reached for her wand to clean herself, the tip sprayed bubbles everywhere, burying her in a froth. She finally clawed free and tried a cleaning charm, but it bizarrely backfired, scattering all the documents in her office into a chaotic flurry. She stepped toward the door, slipped, and crashed into a bookshelf. A heavy magic tome fell and struck her on the head. Ah! She let out a short, pained shriek and blacked out, the bump on her head swelling as she collapsed. The chain of absurd, successive misfortunes happened within seconds after she inhaled the potion's scent. When Sagres heard the scream and rushed in, he found Kestrel submerged in bubbles, half buried under parchment, a large bump on her head in her messy office. At first, he feared an attack, but his quick inspection showed something stranger. Kestrel had been afflicted by a particularly awkward curse, one he did not recognize. He acted at once, taking the unconscious professor to St. Mungo's and collecting the suspicious potions. He also had Loctis send urgent word to Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall. By the time the Bronze Feather group arrived at St. Mungo's, Kestrel had regained consciousness. After a series of careful examinations, Hummingbird explained the situation. "The external injuries aren't serious. A few days' rest will suffice," she said, then grew firmer. "But the curse attached to her, that will take some time to dispel." Everyone exchanged worried looks. Kestrel, lying on the hospital bed, was on the verge of tears. "So, once the external injuries heal, I can go home?" she asked, hopeful. "I'm afraid not," Hummingbird replied without hesitation. "You must remain here until the curse's effects subside." Kestrel's face drained of color. How long will that take?" "Perhaps a few months," Hummingbird said, handing her a glass of water. "A few months?" Kestrel's voice climbed. "Stuck in bed the whole time?" "Yes." Hummingbird's tone was steady, "and you must be monitored by a healer at all times." She looked directly at Kestrel and spoke calmly, each word sobering. "Unless you want to sprain your ankle every time you get out of bed, choke every time you drink, or gag every time you eat." All right, Kestrel hurriedly interrupted, pushing the glass away with lingering fear. "Thank you. I'm not thirsty right now. One more thing," Hummingbird added, serious. "Absolutely no magic during this period, and speak slowly so you don't bite your tongue." Kestrel sank back, staring at the hospital's white ceiling as if her soul might slip out of her eyes. Word of her condition reached the school fast. The students' first reactions were shock and concern. Many genuinely liked their often clumsy but always passionate defense against the dark arts professor. But when Professor McGonagall solemnly announced that, because Professor Lumina required a long convalescence, the defense against the dark arts final exam for this term was officially canceled. A complex, mixed feeling spread through the castle. Sympathy and worry mingled with an undeniable flutter of joy. Everyone silently hoped for Professor Lumina's speedy recovery. Yet, in a hidden corner of many hearts, a small, guilty voice whispered, "One less exam, what a blessing." Chapter 169, a room full of unlucky souls, St. Mungo's curse damage ward. The air in the room was heavy enough to taste. Sagres broke the silence first, his face grave. "What exactly happened?" Nightingale frowned. How could someone contract a curse this powerful? Kestrel's voice was barely audible. I was trying to brew a calming potion." "Calming potion?" everyone repeated, brows knitting. "Why brew that?" Thunderbird asked. "I saw the students were anxious about their exams," Kestrel said softly. "They were all so worried. I thought—" "The recipe?" Nightingale cut in. "Tell me the steps in detail." Kestrel went through the recipe and procedure honestly. Nightingale confirmed the recipe itself was correct. But as Kestrel described the steps, Nightingale's expression grew darker. "You added the armadillo bile in the wrong order," Nightingale said. Kestrel startled. "But a wrong order shouldn't cause this." Nightingale fixed her with a hard look. "Did you do anything else?" Kestrel's eyes slid away. Her voice dwindled to a whisper. "At the end, I added a drop of Felix Felicis." Nightingale's eyebrow twitched. "You what?" "I thought, maybe if the students drank it, they'd have better luck in the exams," Kestrel muttered, shrinking into the hospital bed. A chorus of helpless sighs filled the ward. Everyone rubbed their foreheads, as if trying to herd their scattered thoughts back together. Sagres produced a small bottle from Kestrel's satchel, something he'd taken from her office before she was sent to St. Mungo's. "Is this it?" he asked. Kestrel glanced at the dark liquid and nodded. Nightingale held the bottle up to the light. The potion inside was an abyssal, ink-black color. "A highly unusual, dangerously destructive variant," she murmured. "A curse potion." "What does it do?" Thunderbird asked. "It's not entirely clear," Nightingale said, turning the bottle slowly in her hand. "If Felix Felicis is a luck potion, this seems to be the opposite, a misfortune potion." Faces drained of color. A cold shiver crept from foot to chin. Thunderbird couldn't help a mutter. "I don't know whether that's worse than being lucky." Nightingale set the bottle on the table with deliberate care. "Unknown properties, unknown effects, and unknown cures. Our first priority is to analyze how the curse triggers." "I need to return to Beauxbatons," she said. "They have an alchemy workshop and the equipment we'll need." Sagres nodded. Swift leaned forward, staring at the little black vial, baffled. "Just this one bottle? It looks ordinary." He glanced at Kestrel incredulously. "You smelled it?" "I didn't drink it," she said, staring at the ceiling. "I only smelled it." Swift froze. He had been leaning a fraction too close to the bottle. Sagres was quicker. He flicked his wand and intoned sharply, "Sealus Arctus!" The cork glowed and snapped shut under a thin veil of magic. They all held their breath. After a beat, Sagres asked, "Do you remember the smell?" Swift frowned as if reaching for a memory. "A faint rotten egg scent and cheap perfume." Kestrel blinked. "No, it didn't smell like that at the time." Sagres held up a hand to stop more interruptions. Nightingale spoke slowly, a chill in her voice. "Felix Felicis smells different to everyone. It takes on the drinker's favorite scent. If this is truly an inverse, it likely smells like a person's most hated odor." "Everyone's most hated smell?" Swift finished, pale. "Exactly," Nightingale said. A silence answered. Swift swallowed. "Am I affected?" The other's silence was answer enough. Sagres made a quick assessment. "When I went into Kestrel's office, I smelled strong car exhaust." Thunderbird frowned. "When Swift opened the bottle, I was nearby. I caught a whiff of something dusty." All eyes turned to Hummingbird. She admitted softly, "I think I smelled something unpleasant, too." Nightingale let out a small, relieved breath. "I was farther away and I put up a bubblehead charm the moment the bottle was opened. I didn't smell anything." "So," Sagres counted, Except for Nightingale, the five of us, Kestrel, Swift, Thunderbird, Hummingbird, and myself, were exposed. Will different exposures mean different durations? Swift asked, grasping for hope. Possibly, Sagres said, looking at Kestrel on the bed, haggard and ashamed, but I wouldn't expect any less than 48 hours. Nightingale addressed them all, her tone equal parts sympathy and warning. For the next few days, you'll need to keep very low-key. Avoid crowds, stay away from heavy concentration, and be extremely careful with anything you touch or drink. A few resigned sighs rustled through the room. They all understood what low-key would mean. Tread lightly, speak quietly, and brace for a run of bad luck that might come in whispers or sudden misfortunes. Exactly the sort of things a misfortune potion would amplify. Chapter 170. The Goddess of Misfortune is Smiling. The chaos at St. Mungo's had finally ebbed. Nightingale had rushed off to Beauxbatons with the unknown potion, leaving Sagres and the other five in a quiet, uneasy stillness in the ward. The air still seemed to cling to their most hated odors, and an invisible weight, misfortune, hung over them like a parasite. I must return to Hogwarts, Sagres said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but unyielding. The finals can't be postponed. The papers aren't finalized, and the invigilation arrangements need confirming. He glanced at the wilted Kestrel on the bed. You get some rest. Nightingale will find a way to lift the curse. As for the rest of you, his eyes swept over Swift, Thunderbird, and Hummingbird. Stay somewhere safe, cut down on activity, and wait for news from Nightingale. Swift stared at the hand that had held the potion a moment before, a bitter look on her face. Professor, are you sure you should go back now? Thunderbird and Hummingbird exchanged worried looks as well. Sagres took a measured breath, forcing the irritation the misfortune potion stirred down. It's my duty. Hogwarts is relatively safe. I'll stay in my office and won't go anywhere. He tried to appear composed, as if the curse were little more than an annoyance. In his mind, he already sketched out a quiet landing spot outside the castle, on a grassy stretch by the edge of the Black Lake, a long way from the Humping Willow. Then, in a careful, hush-toned voice, he cast apparition. The world folded. Just as his feet were about to touch Hogwarts earth, the long-dormant bad luck finally made itself known. A faint, chilling, tearing sound split the air. Sagres staggered, his usually solemn face flickering with surprise. A sharp pain shot through his left hand. He looked down. His left pinky was missing at the second joint. The cut was unnervingly smooth, and astonishingly, no blood had yet appeared. Splitting? A low-level mistake he would never have expected to make in over a decade of magic. He crouched and searched the thick grass. Luckily, the damage was confined to that small part. The severed pinky lay a few clover leaves away, a pale, perfect thing. He picked it up with care, fitted it to the wound, and pointed his wand without hesitation. Bone to flesh! A soft, milky light flowed from the wand tip and wrapped the finger and the wound. Sagres felt the skin and bone knit together under the spell. Moments later, the pinky was as it had been. He let out a long breath, feeling drained as if from a battle. He vowed not to apparat again until the curse was entirely gone. He drew his bronze feather badge and sent a brief message to the others. Avoid apparition. Use portkeys, the flue, or the night bus. He had believed that such ordinary magic could never fail him, but complacency had cost him. Dumbledore had been right. His arrogance was hard to root out. Knowing misfortune clung to him, he should not have taken the risk. Sagres trudged back to the castle, declining all greetings, and went straight to his office. He locked the wooden door securely behind him. Nowhere to go, he murmured, looking at the thick stack of parchment on his desk, the unfinished drafts of the final exams. For now, that was all he would do. Exam week arrived with a steady drizzle of small disasters. There were 2 quill rebellions and a self-combusting parchment before the first bell. 2 days had passed since the curse had first touched them. Swift and Thunderbird were mostly recovered, but the misfortune still clung to Sagres stubbornly. He suspected invigilating would be a nightmare, so he chose the safest route. He had Loctus invigilate on his behalf, and every exam would be written only. Without him to trip over, the tests proceeded fairly smoothly. When the bell rang for the final exam, students filed out relieved, handing in thick stacks of parchment. Through Loctus's raven eyes, Sagres watched the papers pile up, and felt some of the tension he'd carried for days begin to loosen. "Go find Dobby," he instructed. Loctus's dark eyes reflected his expressionless face. The raven spread his wings and flew off toward the forbidden forest. To minimize the chance that misfortune would latch onto anything else, Sagres had decided to remain still unless movement was absolutely necessary. With a soft pop, a house elf materialized at his feet. Dobby's wide, bulging eyes were a mixture of excitement and dread. "The great master summons Dobby? Dobby will do anything. Anything." "Quiet, Dobby." Sagres kept his voice steady, his gaze level. "Do you see that pile of exam papers?" Dobby followed his eyes to the thick stack and the ink-dipped quill beside it. "Yes, yes, master, Dobby sees them. Dobby can—" "Good." Sagres began to dictate the grading rubric. 3 points for correctly writing the key steps of the spell. 2 points for fully spelling out the spell's evolution process. If they give a clear theoretical explanation but lack practical examples, deduct 1 point. Answers that are off-topic or dangerous get 0. Halfway through, misfortune struck again. As if with a will of its own, his tongue unexpectedly snapped against his teeth. He felt the sharp sting but managed his expression perfectly. He pressed his tongue against the bitten spot, tasting a faint iron tang, and kept talking as if nothing had happened. For 2 points, clear theoretical explanations, but lacking practical examples. Before he could finish the sentence, the tongue slipped toward his teeth again. This time, the pain was more pronounced. His jaw tightened, and a flash of helplessness crossed his eyes. He drew a steadying breath, checked quickly that he hadn't broken the skin, and resumed without pausing for more than a heartbeat. Support. Deduct 1 point. Answers completely off topic or causing dangerous consequences receive 0 points. He paused now, not from the pain, but to steady himself against a third strike. He closed his eyes a moment, then opened them, composure restored. "Do you remember all that? Follow these standards exactly. Do not improvise." Dobby's enormous ears trembled at Sagres' brief, almost imperceptible gasp and pause, but the elf dared not ask any questions. He nodded frantically. "Dobby understands. Dobby will follow exactly. Not 1 word will be wrong. Dobby promises." He shuffled toward the pile, took the quill with exaggerated caution, and sat down to work with an air of solemnity bordering on tragic. He graded as if the exam papers were the book of life and death itself. Chapter 171, Luna's Lost and Found Notice. Sagres watched Dobby's small hunched back as the house elf scribbled furiously and once again ran his tongue lightly over the slight numbness inside his mouth. The sting was fading, only a faint, tingly aftertaste remained. He exhaled softly. Whatever sharp edges of misfortune had grazed him in the last 2 days, they had at least left him with only a few bitten tongues this time. No spilled ink, no erupting exam papers, no rebellious quills. Compared to everything else, this was a relative mercy. He sat up straighter and gazed toward the blurred outline of the forbidden forest outside the window. The only sound now the scratch of Dobby's quill on parchment. The students were still waiting for their results to be posted, and the castle's earlier tension had dissolved into a swell of noise and energy. Corridors buzzed with loud chatter and laughter, common rooms clustered with plans for the holidays, and even the portraits seemed infected by the mood, singing off-key. The air tasted like freedom. With the holidays so near, Hogwarts felt like a party about to break up. Outside that torrent of noise, Sagres stood at his office window, looking down across the bustling grounds through the raven Loctus's keen eyes. He needed to make sure of one thing. Azkaban Greengrass could not be made the target of family scrutiny over the summer. "Write a letter for me," he said without turning. "Send it to Greengrass Manor. Don't mince words. Tell them every member of the family must keep cordial relations." He paused, then added, "Remind them that the holidays are for family reunions and that excessive harshness is bad for both mind and body." And if anyone ignores that, he thought of the reclusive elders skulking in the manor's shadows. His voice went cold. They will face the consequences. "Dobby obeys," the house elf said, nodding frantically. His large ears flapped. Loctus's view swept over the noisy crowd below until it settled on a corridor near Ravenclaw Tower. There, several students had gathered around a small scene that didn't match the surrounding gaiety. Luna Lovegood looked as ethereal as ever, clutching a roll of parchment that listed lost items. a shoe embroidered with house elf patterns on the vamp, a carrot necklace, and a copy of the Quibbler. Beside her stood Astoria Greengrass, usually soft-spoken, but now like a startled kitten poised on the edge. A circle of Ravenclaw boys and girls blocked their way, their faces twisted into mocking grins. "Hey, is the crazy girl looking for her hallucinations again?" Mason Larry called, raising his voice to draw attention. "Lose your blibbering humdinger net this time?" His companions snickered into hands. One of the girls bumped the notice board on purpose. The lost and found notice Astoria had just pinned slipped crookedly with a whoosh. Astoria's cheeks flamed. She jerked her wand out, knuckles white around it. The timid look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a heat of anger and fear. "Leave us alone," she snapped, voice trembling then hardening. "You've gone too far. We gone too far." Larry spread his hands in mock innocence, eyes sliding disdainfully over Luna. "You're the ones putting your weird things everywhere. Shouldn't someone clean them up?" A few of his friends nodded. "Don't think I don't know. You lot hide her things." Astoria's chest heaved, and she practically screamed, drawing more students to the edge of the crowd. She held her wand aloft, arm trembling with the force of her emotion, as if it might break. "I'm warning you. Give them back now, or—" She drew a shaky breath and finished. "I'll challenge you to a duel." The words landed like a small bomb. A stunned hush rippled through the onlookers. Astoria, challenge someone to a duel? For Luna Lovegood? It was unexpected enough to be newsworthy. Mason Larry stared for a moment, then burst into loud laughter. "A duel? For this Lovegood? Has your brain gone soft? Or—" He looked Astoria up and down with cruel amusement. "Are you one of them now? A freak like her?" "Shut up!" Astoria's wand tip crackled with dangerous sparks. Luna, calm as a summer sky, slipped an arm around her and gently pulled her back. "It's all right," Luna said, voice dreamy and steady, as if the confrontation didn't exist. She squeezed Astoria's hand. "Don't be angry, Astoria. Lost things always come back in unexpected ways. Getting angry only makes blibbering humdingers nest in your ears." "See, even she doesn't care," Larry sneered, ready to unleash another insult. "You." A hoarse metallic caw cut him off, reverberating along the corridor. The sound was so harsh and sudden, it drowned everything else. Every head turned as if frozen in place. A raven was perched on the high stained glass windowsill, as still and black as a carved stone. Its coal dark eyes locked coldly on Mason Larry and his loudest cronies. The corridor dropped into an absolute silence, so complete you could hear a pin fall. "It's Professor Greengrass's raven," someone breathed. The bird spread its shadowy wings, wheeled in the air, and landed with grace on Astoria's shoulder. It cocked its head, glanced at the lost and found notice in her hand, then snapped at the parchment with a lightning peck. In the next instant, it hurtled toward Mason Larry like a black blur and slapped the paper across his face with a sharp thwack. Before he could pull it away, the raven had already hopped to his other shoulder, its talons digging into the fabric of his robes. Mason Larry went pale. He knew that Raven's owner and the stories that clung to that name, how one had cut off Umbridge's finger in plain sight and suffered no reprisal. Fear ran cold down him. Find them. The raven's harsh, unpleasant voice sounded in his ear, and every hair on Mason Larry's body stood up. Chapter 172, Badger Courtyard's Surprise. Lochtis the raven turned its small head, its unblinking eyes sweeping slowly over the students who had been the loudest in their jeers. Wherever its gaze fell, it was as if an invisible whip cracked down. The few culprits flinched, no longer daring to hesitate. They scrambled for cover, fumbling to retrieve hidden shoes and magazines. Through it all, Lochtis remained perched on Mason Larry's shoulder like a heavy black statue, pressing down until he could barely breathe. When Mason, hands trembling, nearly stammered as he returned Luna's things to the loony, a tight smile at last eased from Astoria's tense face. "Thank you, Mr. Lochtis," Luna said in her ethereal voice, hugging her recovered items as if they were treasures. The raven ignored her gratitude. It launched into the air again, glided along the bulletin board, and with its sharp beak tore a precarious notice clean off the wall. A pale flame hissed to life along the edge of the parchment. The flame flickered but did not consume the paper. It left a charred rim, and then, with unnatural precision, the burning page floated into Mason's frozen hand. Mason shook as he unfolded the scorched sheet. The lost and found notice had vanished, replaced by a knife-edged script. Mason Larry, apologize immediately for your and your accomplice's foolish actions. At the same time, submit a detailed written report of this incident to Professor Flitwick. Note, this must be completed before the Hogwarts Express departs. Failure to comply will result in consequences. As soon as Mason and his companions recognized the handwriting, the pale flame flared along the edge again. Though it gave off no heat, the sight was enough to terrify them. Mason's hand slipped, and the parchment drifted away. "Caw!" Loctus shrieked. Mason stumbled, scrambling to pick up the burning paper once more. The writing changed as the page twitched in the air. "Repent for your rudeness and despicable actions. During the summer holiday, completely copy the Muggle book How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie 5 times. On the first day of term, deliver the copied book to the door of the Advanced Charms Theory and Practice office. Failure to complete or perfunctory completion will result in consequences." Loctus's black eyes swept over the frightened faces, pausing a moment on Mason and his associates. They immediately bowed and apologized to Luna and Astoria. Then the raven lost interest in the crowd, spread its dark wings like a streak of ink, and flew away along the vaulted ceiling of the corridor. The great hall buzzed with noise. Young witches and wizards crowded the 4 long tables, waiting for Dumbledore to announce the final winner of the House Cup. This year, Gryffindor and Slytherin, traditionally strong, had both faltered, not only missing the top spot, but solidly occupying the bottom 2 places with nearly identical, dismal point totals. Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff had been neck and neck, their hourglasses almost equal at one point. In the end, Hufflepuff, by the slimmest margin, claimed the House Cup. It was a sight not seen in many years. Professor Sprout's face shone with uncontrollable joy. Her usual gentle smile was radiant. The Hufflepuff table erupted so loudly, their cheers seemed to threaten the enchanted ceiling. Cedric Diggory had been indispensable. He had brought in points with strong classroom performance and turned the tide on the Quidditch pitch, laying the groundwork for the victory. Harry, Ron, and Hermione could not hide their disappointment. Sagres had told them the House Cup's ownership wasn't important, but truly feeling that indifference was proving difficult. Sagres himself did not appear in the noisy Great Hall. He sat in his office, watching Loctus with concentrated attention as the raven flew off, its path traced in his mind's eye, all the way to Beauxbaton's academy. Loctus pierced clouds and came to rest outside an elegant, arched window of Beauxbaton's castle. The raven slid into a bright, spacious potions office, where shelves of exotic magical ingredients gleamed faintly under soft enchantments. A large desk by the window was piled with books, parchment, and delicate instruments. At the other end of the room, a small alchemy station shone with cold metal. Through Loctus's sharp eyes, Sagres saw Nightingale bent over a cauldron at that alchemy station, stirring a viscous liquid that glowed an eerie blue. She looked up only when the raven tapped the window glass. Seeing the familiar black shape eased the tension in her brow. She set aside her stirrer, waved, and the window opened. Loctus flew in and landed on a safe corner of the alchemy bench. "It's you. Did Sagres send you to check on this?" Nightingale asked aloud, as if confiding in the raven. She was used to communicating through this clever bird, though she did not expect it to reply. Loctus had been altered, no longer fully lucid, and the potion recipe she had shared with Sagres to treat the raven's symptoms had not proven very effective. The thought made her let out a quiet sigh. Wiping potion from her fingers with a piece of velvet, she moved to the desk and sat down, fatigue and a touch of frustration in her voice. "Progress is very slow, very, very slow," she said, then unrolled a fine Beauxbaton's parchment and picked up a slender black quill. The raven's dark eyes watched as the quill flowed across the page. Sagres could read the text only through Loctus's vision, unable to hear or transmit sound. Nightingale's letter was more talkative than usual, spilling the results of her work and her worries. "Dear Sagres, Loctus brought your silent inquiry. I regret that I cannot deliver the good news we both hoped for. My research into that troublesome curse has stalled. I have tried every method I could find, but the results have all been failures. The curse's stubborn misfortune exceeds my expectations. After repeatedly studying the pattern of its onset and its subtle link to a host's luck, I have a theoretical hypothesis: Felix Felicis. Felix Felicis might temporarily suppress or counteract the curse's erosion of luck. It would be like creating a calm eddy in a turbulent current, allowing the host a brief respite. I must stress I have not run any experiments to verify this. I strongly advise against attempting it rashly without thorough preparation and risk assessment. It is by no means an antidote. At best, it would act like a painkiller, and its effect would be limited in duration. I will continue to search for a true solution. Treat the Felix Felicis idea only as a last resort backup for extreme circumstances. I hope Loctis can deliver this letter to you quickly. Keep in touch. Yours, Nightingale. Early in the Rose Moon. Chapter 173. Busy Locatus Nightingale set down her quill, blew gently on the ink to dry it, and carefully rolled the parchment before tying it with a dark blue ribbon. "I don't have any mithril dust today," she said, glancing up at Locatus, who stood motionless at the corner of the table. There was a faint apology in her eyes. "So you'll have to fly back on an empty stomach." "Take it to him," she added softly, nudging the rolled letter toward the raven's feet. Locatus did not move, its coal-black eyes fixed on her like polished glass. 2 seconds of silence thickened in the room, charged with an intent that felt more like attention than a bird's instinct. Nightingale's eyebrows rose a little. She set down the hand that had been about to tidy her quill, leaned back in her chair, and returned the raven's steady stare with one of her own. Any trace of worry or apology drained away and was replaced by a composed, knowing calm. "You're watching, aren't you?" she said quietly, breaking the stillness. "Sagres," she continued in the same even tone, "peeking into a lady's private affairs like this is quite rude." She reached down, took the letter back from Locatus's feet, opened a drawer in her desk without looking at the bird again, placed the letter inside, and clicked the lock shut. "Now," she said, refocusing on the raven in the corner with a tone that held a polite dismissal, "you may go." Locatus remained still. Nightingale paused as she arranged the potion bottles, then turned her head. The raven's unusual immobility tugged at her attention again. "Are you going somewhere else?" she asked, softer now, a hint of understanding in her voice. The raven gave no sound, no movement, but its silence was acknowledgement enough. Her brows creased as she considered it, then softened. "All right, that's safer than wandering outside." She took a blank sheet of parchment and wrote quickly, "The antidote is still under research. Everything is normal. P.S. There's no mithril dust. Locatus left my place on an empty stomach. Nightingale." She slid the note into the leather tube strapped to the raven's leg, then looked once more at Locatus's glossy black feathers. Her voice grew very soft but firm, almost like a reprimand. "Then, be careful." The raven stood for a moment as if engraving her words into memory, then, without warning, spread its wings and slipped out through the open window, a black silhouette melting into the deepening twilight outside Bobatas. It did not fly straight back to Hogwarts. Following Sagres's will, it cut across the sky, passed over London, where busy crowds paid no mind to magic, and dropped onto the windowsill of a private ward on the 6th floor of St. Mungo's in the Curse and Injury Department. The ward glowed with soft light and smelled faintly of calming potions. Magical monitoring instruments blinked and hummed around a hospital bed. On that bed, Kestrel lay with a pained expression. Hummingbird, wearing a St. Mungo's healer's robe, sat at the bedside. She looked more tired than when they had last met, but her movements were still swift and gentle. She dabbed Kestrel's dry forehead with a damp cotton ball, attentive and tired. When the raven's shadow crossed the glass, Hummingbird looked up, and seeing the familiar black silhouette, offered a tiny, relieved nod. The window opened, and Locatus hopped inside. "Kestrel, look who's here," Hummingbird said. The raven tucked its head and drew out the rolled parchment from its tube. Hummingbird read it, and then showed it to Kestrel. "So it went to Nightingale's first," she murmured. "Has Sister Nightingale still not made the antidote?" Kestrel asked with an exaggerated sigh. "It's not that simple," Hummingbird replied with a worn smile. "This is a completely new potion. Making a targeted antidote isn't easy." She took a quill and wrote quickly on the parchment. "Everything is normal at the hospital. I don't have any mithril dust here either." Hummingbird Kestrel immediately began to fuss. I want to write too, Sister Rollison. She tried to sit up but fell back, then pleaded, Just help me write it. Hummingbird smiled and complied. All right, right, I'm sorry. Kestrel deflated, and Hummingbird neatly added the words before sliding the parchment back into the tube. Locatus watched the pair for a moment, then flapped its wings and left without lingering. After a long flight, the Raven arrived the following afternoon at an archaeological camp on the edge of Egypt's Valley of the Kings. The sun roasted the vast expanse of sand, and heat shimmered over the dunes. Locatus circled and settled outside a large shade awning at the camp's edge, where the ground was studded with magical detection runes and fragments of carved stone. Swift crouched beside a newly uncovered pit in a sand-colored expedition suit and a broad hat, his arms tanned and strong from the sun. He had recovered his usual agility and was focused, using a delicate magical brush to clear loose sand from a tablet etched with hieroglyphs. A gust of sand blew past, and he moved instinctively to avoid it. Seeing the Raven, he broke into a grin and waved. He pulled the parchment from the leather tube and read it. He nodded, then wore a sheepish smile. I don't have any mithril dust here either. Do you eat owl food? He said, producing a handful of dusty owl biscuits. The Raven eyed the offering and then turned its head away in evident disgust. Ah, so that's not to your taste, Swift said, laughing. He took his wand from his pocket, flicked it casually, and it transformed into a quill. He wrote on the parchment, The curse on my body has completely disappeared. No need to worry. P.S. Locatus still left my place on an empty stomach. He seemed a little unhappy. Swift. He returned the note to the tube. Locatus hopped up, spread its wings, and rose into the western sky, continuing on its errand across the world. Chapter 174. The Americas. When Locatus crossed the vast Atlantic and reached Ilvermorny, a tremendous thunderstorm was raging over the castle. Forked lightning danced through the lead-gray clouds, and thunder rolled like a giant beast, making the air tremble. The robin flew straight through the dense curtain of rain and the howling gale, taking 2 lightning strikes along the way, before finally finding the Thunderbird Dean's office at the highest point of the castle. The office was spacious and solemn, with enormous Thunderbird totems mounted on the walls, their sharp eyes seeming to pierce the room. A roaring fire burned in the hearth, cutting the chill of the stormy night. The gray-haired Thunderbird stood before the tall French windows, watching the tempest. At the sound of wings, he turned slowly and walked to a small side window used for bird messengers. Locatus glided in with practiced ease, trailing the cold scent of rain, and landed on a perch carved with an intricate Thunderbird totem. It shook its wet feathers, sending droplets scattering. The dean regarded the little bird with a softness that belied his imposing presence. He stepped forward and offered a broad, calloused hand. Locatus did not shy away. It allowed him to stroke the wet crown of its head as if accepting the steadiness of an elder's care. You've worked hard, Locatus, the Thunderbird said. He withdrew his hand and looked out at the storm again. Under his calm gaze, the clouds seemed to ease. The storm will pass, his deep voice carried easily over the rumble of thunder. Locatus used its beak to untie the small leather tube bound to its leg, retrieved the rolled parchment, and presented it. The dean unrolled it and read, his eyes moving over several different handwritings. After a moment, he looked up and smiled. All right, don't worry. He scanned the letter again, then turned to a heavy desk. From a drawer, he produced a sealed glass jar and scooped out a generous handful of shimmering mithril shavings. He spread them on a clean tray and pushed it toward the robin. Eat your fill here, and leave after the rain. Locatus's eyes brightened. It hopped from the perch onto the desk and pecked eagerly at the precious mithril, the crisp tapping clear in the quiet room as the thunder grew more distant. This journey had been longer than any it had made before. Even at Christmas, when it flew around the world delivering gifts and could return to Hogwarts for Sagres' special meals, it had never been away so long. This time, its route would keep it on the wing through the summer and likely beyond, until the curse on Sagres was lifted. Though magic kept its core alive, sustained high-speed flight still wore on it. While the robin devoured the mithril, the dean sat and took a long feather quill from an elder Thunderbird's tail, dipped it in ink, and wrote beneath the original message in firm strokes. Everything is normal here. No need to worry. Locatus will eat and drink its fill here, and to avoid trouble, it will leave with some mithril shavings. Thunderbird outside. The heavy rain relented to dripping eaves and the distant sounds of students and footsteps returning life to the castle. It's almost time, little one, the dean murmured. He rolled the parchment, slid it into the waterproof tube, and fastened it to Locatus's leg. He also tied a small dragonhide pouch filled with heavy mithril shavings to the bird. Take these. You won't have to worry about rations on the road. He patted the robin gently. Say hello to him for me. Locatus let out a short, low caw and lingered on the perch as if gathering strength or offering a quiet farewell. Then it spread its wet black wings and plunged resolutely into the damp night, continuing its long journey across the globe. Brazil. Rio de Janeiro International Flu Network Coordination Office. Locatus landed on the edge of a large control center. Inside, lights burned bright over a strange sight. A huge three-dimensional sand table model dominated the room, slowly rotating and marking Flu Network nodes across the world. Countless thin lines flickered, linked and unlinked, forming a constantly shifting web of light. A senior Flu Network coordinator stood at the central console, humming a cheerful samba as she swayed with the movement of her wand. She was sweeping spells across the sand table, smoothing spots that flickered too fast or had clogged, keeping global Flu Network traffic flowing. Aha! Locatus is here! She exclaimed when she saw the bird land. She didn't break her rhythm as she worked. Just a moment, dear. Let me clear this London rush hour. Her wand traced a few graceful arcs, and congested red points on the map changed to calm green. There! Done. She set the wand down and hopped over to Locatus, eyeing the leather tube and the dragonhide pouch. I heard they all got hit by some troublesome curse a while ago? She took the parchment from the bird's beak as she spoke. Locatus, sometimes sharp and sometimes simply hungry, sat motionless. After reading, the woman's face lit with understanding. So, you're on a world tour again. Went to the Thunderbird first? Tsk, that explains a lot. She opened the dragonhide pouch and found it empty. Puzzled, she checked for holes. There were none. You ate it all? She said in surprise. Locatus watched her impassively. She sighed, then grabbed a spare quill and wrote in a flamboyant hand in the blank space of the parchment. Everything is normal. Locatus's ration pouch is empty. The moment the pen touched the paper, a glaring red light flared on the three-dimensional map, an immediate congestion alert. Oh no! The coordinator moved with lightning speed. She rolled the parchment up, shoved it back into the leather tube, and yelled into the speaking tube linked to the next office. Loy, shift all mainline loads under my name to your side. I have something to handle here. Received, came Loy's crisp reply, and the tangled lines on the map dimmed, the pressure easing. The coordinator wiped a hand across her brow and turned back to Locatus with a relieved grin. Crisis averted. She produced a small crystal bottle from her uniform pocket and uncorked it. Inside were several pieces of mithril cut like diamonds. Here, I've got snacks for the road. She poured the glittering mithril into the dragonhide pouch. Locatus peered in as it plumped up and let loose a less grumpy squawk of thanks. Leaning against the console, she chatted to the bird as if to an old friend. I stare at this sand table for 3 hours straight every day. My eyes are going. Earning these galleons is no picnic. Caw, the most infuriating thing is my boss. She rolled her eyes theatrically. He lounges in his plush office on thick carpets all day, reading the newspaper or Witch Weekly. When he decides to wander out, he just points and hands out useless orders. I'd like to hex that slick forehead of his. Caw. Luckily, I've got a few miserable coordinators under me, she continued with a hint of smugness. When I'm swamped, I can secretly offload work to them. Otherwise, I'd collapse at this console. Caw. But they're painfully slow. Tasks I can finish in half an hour, they'll drag into 3. If I want to scold them, they're exhausted, eyes bloodshot, looking pitiful. Sigh. Caw. And so she kept up a running monologue, the robin's caws punctuating it like an audience, while the sand table revolved and the city beyond the office hummed with life. Chapter 175, Traveling Around the World. Half an hour later, the senior coordinator of the International Flu Network Coordination Office finally paused to gulp down a long draught of water. Her throat was dry from talking so much. Phew, "It was a pleasure chatting with you, Loquetus." She smiled and waved at the raven. "Off you go. Have a safe journey. I'm heading home now, too." "Caw!" Loquetus spread its wings, glanced once at the control room, full of humming, magical instruments, and then streaked like a black comet into the starlit sky. A few days later, in Sydney, the raven appeared on the upper floor of the International Confederation of Wizards Bulletin headquarters and landed precisely outside the window of a large open-plan office. Inside, the scene was a marvel of magic. Countless bulletin boards floated in midair, dense text scrolling and updating like a waterfall. News flashes, official notices, emergency alerts, and rumors from every corner of the globe converged, collided, and were filtered here. Uniformed staff hurried about, flicking their wands to classify, archive, or urgently redirect streams of information. The air smelled faintly of parchment and ink, underscored by the low hum of high-speed information flow. The stork stood at the center of the room before a hub made of layered parchments. He wore a crisp gray suit. His hair was combed back, and gold-rimmed spectacles rested on his nose. Behind those lenses, his keen eyes scanned the ever-moving text, while his wand tapped the air. Each tap enlarged an important headline and sent it to a specific floating board, or marked a suspicious inflammatory stream with a scarlet quarantine rune and diverted it to a review queue. Loquetus landed silently on a metal perch set aside for messengers. The stork did not fully turn his head. He only swept his gaze over the raven and kept tapping his wand without missing a beat. "Wait 30 seconds, he said evenly, without any extra emotion. He was in the middle of an urgent report about an abnormal migration of magical creatures in part of South America. 30 seconds later, after passing his current cue to a subordinate, the stork turned and took the parchment from the raven. He scanned the various short reports and scrawled notes, a thin, practiced smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "I don't have mithril on hand here," he said, "but the cafeteria downstairs keeps special owl feed. Need any?" Loquetus shook its head. The stork said no more. He pushed his glasses up, drew a black pen from his pocket, uncapped it with a smooth flick, and wrote on the parchment, "All normal." P.S. According to an internal report, Hummingbird's conferral of the Merlin's Order First Class is scheduled for mid-August. Congratulations. Stork. The ink said as if by charm. He rolled the parchment and tucked it back into the leather tube strapped to the raven's leg. The raven did not take off at once. It folded its wings and sat on the cold metal perch, motionless for a long time. Only when a dusty owl messenger landed with a weary hoot did Loquetus, as if remembering, spread its wings and made room for the newcomer. Next came a long flight across continents and oceans. Loquetus set off again, flying without rest toward Africa, the last stop on its globe-spanning consolation tour. If everything went well, once this errand was complete, it could return to the familiar tower at Hogwarts and resume its idle, watchful life. Traveling the world on your own wings was no small undertaking. More than 10 days had passed since it left the castle. A regular owl would have been exhausted by now. Johannesburg, South Africa. The Gem Merchants Guild headquarters. Loquetus landed on a hidden terrace high above the city. From there, it overlooked the busy Muggle streets and the tucked-away magical market. The air smelled of dust and spices. Snowy Owl sat at a large workbench, inlaid with gemstones, wearing a tailored silk robe and a pair of crystal goggles that let her see the internal magic within stones. The terrace had little cover, but an invisible barrier kept out noise and prying eyes. Sunlight fell across her as she held a pigeon egg-sized deep red gem up to the light, tweezers poised. The raven's landing interrupted her concentration. She set the gem and tweezers down, lifted her goggles, revealing a sharp, shrewd face. Her eyes fell to the deflated dragonhide pouch strapped to the raven's leg. Her slender eyebrows lifted, and a knowing smile curved her lips. "Looks like the journey's taken its toll," she murmured. She reached for a small silver box inlaid with turquoise on the bench. Inside were cold, polished mithril ingots. She grabbed a few and dropped them into a tiny, exquisitely enameled dish with a crisp clink. "Here, extra rations." Her voice was hoarse from long hours of work. Loquetus hopped onto the railing and began pecking enthusiastically at the mithril. Snowy Owl didn't immediately return to her work. She set her goggles aside and, watching the raven eat, said casually, "Let me guess, Did the letter say I'm to take over the British market? The raven ignored her, intent on its meal. Snowy Owl chuckled and pulled the rolled parchment from its leather tube. She unrolled it and skimmed the short reports in the stork's note. "Flying so far?" she said, looking again at the tireless raven and shaking her head. "Looks like what he and Kestrel got mixed up in this time is worse than I thought." She dipped a quill and, in a graceful, flowing hand, wrote a reply in the blank space on the parchment. "Congratulations, Hummingbird. I met Professor Kettleburn 2 days ago. He promised to introduce me to several reputable bookstores in Diagon Alley. Cooperation is progressing smoothly. Snowy Owl is." She rolled the parchment back up and slipped it into the leather tube. Loyalties finished its extra helping and gave a low, satisfied cry, as if to say thanks. Snowy Owl waved it off. There was no need to linger. The raven spread its powerful wings and melted once more into the bright African sunlight, continuing on its long, lonely route around the world. Chapter 176. A Raven's Life is Also a Life. Loyalties, travel-worn, fluttered down and landed on the windowsill of Sagres' office. The setting sun poured through the stained glass, casting long, colored shadows across the floor. Sagres stood with his back to the window, an old restricted section book in hand, fingers tracing its thick spine. "Welcome back," he said without turning. The raven hopped expertly onto his shoulder, used its beak to untie the leather tube bound to its leg, and dropped it into Sagres' open palm. He crossed to his desk, unrolled the parchment, news about the Bronze Feather members, but only glanced at it before tucking it into a drawer. He had already seen everything through Loyalties' eyes. Everyone seemed busy. He needed something to occupy himself as well. On the desk lay a letter from Lyle Lupin, full of thanks and particular interest in the magic Sagres had used against Peeves. Sagres drew a fresh sheet from the drawer, picked up a special quill with a glimmering tip, dipped it, and began to write. He recorded the Chaos Storm's magical flow pattern and an analysis diagram in meticulous detail. Incantations, formulas, structure, magic pathways, theoretical deductions, and several conjectures about possible applications. When he finished, he gently blew the ink dry, rolled the parchment carefully, and said, "Deliver this to, then return." He named an address. Loyalties, without even pausing for water, set off again. Thankfully, this time the destination was not far, a secluded, ivy-covered cottage in Gwent. Through the raven's eyes that night, Sagres watched the old man's home. The interior was simply furnished and a little worn. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph in a scuffed frame. The glass was clean and bright. It was a magical photograph of a younger Lyle Lupin, a gentle-faced witch smiling, and a toddler with soft, curly brown hair in her arms. The boy laughed, reaching to grab his mother's hair. The three looked simply, warmly happy, once Lyle's whole world. That happiness had been cruelly shattered. On the rickety wooden wall were tacked several long-expired copies of the Daily Prophet and a few Ministry Wanted posters. The most handled, its corners curled from being turned over and over, showed a ferocious man with mad eyes, Fenrir Greyback. The poster listed the werewolf leader's crimes: attacking muggles, creating werewolves, torturing wizards to death. Beneath it, newspaper clippings about Greyback's attacks had been pasted up. Sagres noticed that one clipping was dated soon after Lyle resigned from the ministry. An open notebook lay on the desk, pages filled with cramped, messy handwriting. Titles peered out: Werewolf Potion Material Replacement Conjecture, Lunar Phases and Werewolf Aggression Correlation. The notes were written with a desperate intensity. The old man now stood before the wall, calloused fingers repeatedly tracing the curled wanted poster. Sagres' eyes showed nothing outwardly, but he understood. Lyle Lupin's widowhood, the ruined family in the photo, the shift in his research, all pointed to one brutal origin: Fenrir Greyback. His wife and child had likely been victims of Greyback or his pack. On the windowsill, Loyalties ruffled its feathers and let out a short, hoarse cry that drew the old man's attention. Lyle turned, puzzled. The raven tilted its head and fixed him with those obsidian eyes, then lowered its beak and placed the rolled parchment on the table. "It's you," Lyle said, a note of surprise in his voice. He picked up the parchment and began to read, eyebrows knitting as he murmured to himself, "Ah, I had thought of this but couldn't put it into practice. Wild imagination. I never considered this. What a pity. My work on poltergeists has been neglected these past years." He read on, absorbed. After a while, he looked up at the raven. "I'm sorry, there's nothing to eat here. Owls rarely come by," he offered with an apologetic smile. Locatus stared without blinking, its gaze unnervingly human in its intensity. Then, in a stiff, flat voice that made Lyle's skin prickle, it said, "Fenrir Greyback. Dead." Lyle froze. The lines on his face tightened, his cloudy eyes went wide as if the air had been knocked from him. He opened his mouth, lips moving in an attempt to form a question, to confirm, but the raven gave him no chance. It added, still flat, "Time of death, December, 2 years ago." Without another look, Locatus spread its wings and slipped into the night as swiftly as it had come. Lyle was left alone, suddenly bereft of the one thing that had anchored him for years. The wanted poster of his enemy drifted silently to the floor. On the mantel, the woman in the photograph still smiled. The child still gurgled as if nothing had happened. In the fireplace, the last embers had died. Greyback was dead. He had been dead for 2 years. The news hit Lyle not with relief, but with a hollow bewilderment. The hatred that had sustained him, the obsession that had driven his sleepless nights and frantic experiments, had lost its target. He slumped into the worn armchair with a dull thud. News had recently spread about Damocles Belby's development of the wolfsbane potion, and Lyle had immediately found a way to obtain the formula. The hope was brief. The ingredients required were rare and ruinously expensive, too costly even for a single brew, let alone for steady, lifelong use. For a struggling wizard on the edge of poverty, the potion was an unattainable luxury. He stared, defeated, back at his open notebook, pages of frantic notes about werewolves, lunar cycles, and ways to curb their ferocity. He had once believed that thorough research might at least ease his son's suffering or give him some means of revenge. But his enemy's death collapsed the scaffolding of his purpose. His son remained cursed somewhere, alone and exposed, while an antidote existed only beyond their reach. Despair settled deeper than any news about Greyback. The pain in that ivy-covered cottage ran far deeper than a dead adversary. A family torn apart, a son marginalized by society, a father trapped by age and poverty, and a cure that sat so close yet could not be claimed. That was the true, lingering gloom that filled the house. Chapter 177, Misfortune Fades. After more than 10 days of self-imposed seclusion, Sagres finally felt the curse within him begin to ebb. Like stones exposed when the tide goes out, a long-lost lightness settled back into his body. He drew a deep breath of air scented with grass and wood, then pushed open the oak door of his office, which had been shut for days. The corridor was empty. The students' voices had already vanished with the start of summer vacation. Sagres walked with purpose toward the great hall. Nothing announced a return to normal better than a hot meal. He was not picky about food, but being able to eat like a normal person was a comfort he had missed. The hall was so quiet he could hear his own footsteps echo. At the high table, however, he found Albus Dumbledore waiting. The headmaster sat with a small dish of creamy pudding drizzled in maple syrup before him, his silver fork poised in the air, blue eyes twinkling behind his half-moon spectacles, as if he had been expecting him. Sagres. Dumbledore's voice carried across the empty hall. "It's truly good to see you out of your room." "Indeed." Sagres took the high-backed chair he always used without hesitation and reached for a large spoonful of mashed potatoes. "Something wrong?" he asked, his fork already aiming at a roasted carrot on his plate. Dumbledore nodded and pierced a piece of pudding with his fork. "Earlier today, I visited Professor Lumina at St. Mungo's." Sagres' chewing slowed. Dumbledore sighed, sympathy evident in his eyes. "Unfortunately, the injuries were worse than I feared. The healers did everything they could, but the conclusion is she won't be able to return to teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts next school year, possibly much longer. Her body needs a long period of rest." "Is that so?" Sagres' tone was flat. "That's regrettable." Underneath the civility, there was no warmth, only the bare acknowledgement of the fact. "Yes, regrettable," Dumbledore agreed, taking another bite. "It also means we must find a new professor for Defense Against the Dark Arts, a notoriously difficult post, before September." Sagres chewed the carrot in silence. Finding a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher had always been problematic. The position seemed to come with its own misfortunes. Dumbledore's voice brightened as if he had found a solution. Fortunately, I have someone very suitable in mind, a most talented person who has shown courage and wisdom even through hard times. Oh, Sagres sounded distracted, his thoughts still on the professor at St. Mungo's. Who is it? Remus Lupin. Dumbledore said the name plainly. Sagres stopped chewing altogether. You know him? Dumbledore set down his fork and regarded him with interest. No. Sagres shook his head and went back to his plate, trying to appear nonchalant. Is he from Ravenclaw? No. Gryffindor, Dumbledore said with a small smile. He was a Gryffindor prefect, in fact. You needn't worry about his knowledge. I see. Sagres set down his knife and fork and spoke more clearly, louder than before. Since you already have a candidate, and I'm planning to get some fresh air, if you think it appropriate, I could make the trip and speak to Mr. Lupin myself. Dumbledore's eyes widened a little at the offer, as if he tried to peer into Sagres. After a moment, he nodded. Of course, thank you, but please, be gentle in your approach. He is a kind man. His life since graduation has been difficult. Sagres inclined his head. Do you have his address? You must have been in contact with him. Yes, I'll be leaving tomorrow morning. Write whatever you need to say. I can deliver your letter along with my message. Dumbledore drank from his goblet and set it down. That works well. I have other matters to attend to these next 2 days. What matters? Sagres asked. Dumbledore's expression all at once turned grave. Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban. Sagres repeated the name, frowning. Sirius Black, the one who betrayed the Potters? That's right, Dumbledore said. He was responsible for the betrayal that led to that tragedy. After all these years, he's still alive? Sagres sounded surprised. To survive Azkaban and still manage to escape. I was surprised as well, Dumbledore admitted. But this is the Ministry's failure. Sagres looked up. What has this to do with you? Dumbledore's gaze was steady. He likely escaped with a single purpose. Sagres paused. You mean revenge on his former master? It seems likely, Dumbledore said. Which makes Harry Potter's situation particularly dangerous. Finding Black is urgent. He continued. Cornelius has invited me to assist in the investigation to determine how Black managed to escape. The Ministry is in turmoil, afraid others might attempt the same, and afraid that Black, once free, will cause even worse harm. Sagres pursed his lips. So that's why you sought me out. You once hunted dark wizards and served as an auror at the Ministry, Dumbledore said, looking directly at him. If possible, I would like your help in finding him. This is, of course, a personal request. After a moment, Sagres asked, and what's the reward? Dumbledore dabbed his mouth with a napkin. First of all, let me assure you, I'm not short of galleons. That's one way to put it. Sagres considered, then offered a dry smile. How about wool socks? Dumbledore's half-smile deepened, and he shook his head. Clearly not sufficient. Then is there anything else you want? A favor? Sagres asked. For now, owe me one, Dumbledore said lightly. I'll tell you what I want in due time. Before he left, he turned back. Did you ask anyone else? Oh, not only you, Dumbledore replied with that familiar, mysterious smile. I've mentioned it to a few old friends. The more eyes we have searching, the sooner we'll find him. Sagres had spent the night in the library. At dawn the next day, Professor Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes, arrived looking for him, a letter clamped in its beak and its fiery tail feathers shimmering. For some reason, Loyalties was always hostile toward the phoenix, perhaps jealous of its bright plumage or its melodious song. Sagres could understand. His stupid raven's croak was hardly anything to boast about. Still, the raven had its uses. Though its voice was harsh, it could speak. Though it couldn't weep, it could make a mess. It couldn't apparate, but it could gnaw through mithril. And while it didn't have flaming red feathers, its black plumage carried a strange iridescence. Sagres tucked the letter into his pocket and gave an order to Loyalties, which was still glaring sullenly at the phoenix. Go to this address and keep an eye on Harry Potter's home. If anything happens nearby, alert me immediately. He handed the raven the address Dumbledore had sent the night before. Since he'd accepted the commission, he had to be prepared. The raven looked thoroughly unwilling, but it had no choice. It flapped off resentfully. After breakfast in the Great Hall, Sagres used his swift shadow form to arrive outside a small cottage belonging to Lyle Lupin. The walls were mottled, and a few herbs on the windowsill looked a little wilted. He knocked gently on the weathered wooden door. There was the soft sound of footsteps inside, then a creak as the door opened. "Who are you?" An elderly man with white hair and a stooped figure peered out, his cloudy eyes full of confusion. "Hello, Mr. Lupin. We corresponded yesterday." Sagres's tone was calm as he let his gaze sweep casually across the modest interior. Lyle blinked, then his face registered surprise. "Are you Mr. Greengrass? I mean, Professor?" His voice held a mix of embarrassment and wonder. He hadn't expected the correspondent to be so young. "Please come in. Sit down." "Just call me Sagres," he said with a small smile and stepped into the cottage. The room smelled faintly of herbs and old books. Sagres chose the sturdiest-looking chair and sat. "Is Peeves getting used to staying here?" he asked lightly. "I suppose he might not be pleased with my arrangements." "He's been uncooperative," Lyle admitted as he fussed with the cluttered table and fetched a cup of water. "And my research on non-human spirits, it's been shelved for too long. It's only at the observation stage." He pushed the cup toward Sagres, then looked the young man over again with a discreet, troubled glance. Sagres noticed. He picked up the cup, took a sip, and set it down slowly. "I hope my unannounced visit hasn't disrupted your research," he said evenly. "Not at all." Lyle waved his hands, flustered. He lowered his voice and sat down carefully on another creaky chair, his hands fidgeting on his knees. I have a question. How did you know about my feud with Fenrir Greyback?" The older man's question was threaded with old pain and a wary undertone. Sagres let his eyes drift to the yellowed newspaper clippings and wanted posters pinned to the wall, Fenrir Greyback's grim face staring back. He pointed to them casually. "Did you think it required a subtle deduction?" he asked. "Or perhaps my raven tells me more than it should." Lyle understood at once and sagged a little. 2 years ago, I ran into Greyback and his pack at Oak Market, southwest of Black Marsh Town. I had to deal with them for reasons. He fell silent, listening to Sagres speak without agitation. The old man's astonishment at Sagres's composure softened into understanding. Not every professor in Hogwarts rosters deserved the title, but anyone capable of crafting their own magic was undeniably formidable. "So what brings you here this time?" Lyle asked cautiously, curiosity and caution braided into his tone. "Just passing by to check in and deliver a message." Sagres's voice remained steady. "Professor Dumbledore intends to hire a new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. He has chosen Remus Lupin." Lyle's reaction was immediate and fierce. "What?" Disbelief breaking into his face. Sagres added quietly, "He asked me to find him." "Remus, he's my son, yes?" Sagres's question invited confirmation, and Lyle's shoulders tightened with the flood of emotion. After a long moment, he nodded. Joy, worry, and fear chased one another over his lined face. That Dumbledore would offer such a post to Remus, knowing their history, was confounding and yet somehow hopeful. Sagres had no patience for idle speculation. "I'll go find him now. If there are letters you need delivered, I can take them." He set a heavy pouch of galleons on the table. "This is research funding for your work with Peeves. I'll deliver the rest at the end of each month." He raised a hand before Lyle could protest. "It's not a gift. If you accept the funding, future research results will need to be shared with me." Lyle stiffened at that condition, staring at the pouch for a long second before meeting Sagres's calm gaze. Finally, with a firm voice that betrayed resignation and relief, he said, "Very well. Good." Sagres rose and straightened his robes. "Do you have anything you want to send with me?" "Wait, please." Lyle hurried to a desk and grabbed a piece of parchment and a balled quill. He dipped it in ink and wrote quickly in a cramped, urgent hand. Sagres took the still damp letter and, after a quick farewell, stepped into shadow and vanished. Pop. He reappeared in a dark East London alley that smelled of fish and coal dust, his figure materializing beside a stack of musty wooden crates. The alley was more squalid and oppressive than the cottage, peeling plaster, the damp smell of rot, and the distant, clamorous noise of a dock. He brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his robes and scanned the narrow passage. Following the address Dumbledore had given him, Sagres pushed deeper into the neighborhood toward a ramshackle apartment building. The stairwell was dim and fetid, the paint blistered, and the air thick with cheap tobacco and stale food. He found the room on the top floor. Its number plate was nearly rubbed away. He knocked, 3 clear, firm knocks that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. No answer came. Expecting an empty room, he didn't linger. He headed straight for the docks. Under a pewter sky, cargo ships loomed as men loaded and unloaded their holds. A group of worn, grimy workers shuffled heavy sacks and wooden crates back and forth along slick gangplanks, bodies straining against the wet and mud. Sweat, rain, and seawater soaked their coarse garments. Sagres moved through the crowd and quickly picked him out, Remus Lupin, blending into the laborers but unmistakable. Chapter 179. The Hunt Begins. Remus Lupin wore a faded, coarse linen coat whose shoulders had been worn through by heavy loads. His prematurely graying hair clung damply to his forehead. He struggled under the weight of a wooden crate that looked heavier than himself, his back slightly hunched. Each step sank into mud, leaving deep footprints. Sweat ran down his gaunt cheeks and mixed with grime on his neck. Around him, other laborers worked with the same hollow resignation, the air thick with heavy breathing and the impatient shouts of overseers. Not far away, Sagres stood quietly, his clean wizarding robes strikingly out of place against the grimy dock, like an abrupt apparition. He watched Lupin until the latter set down his burden, raised a tattered sleeve to wipe his brow, and inadvertently caught sight of him. Lupin's movements froze. Bewilderment flitted across his exhausted face, followed by incredulous shock and then a wary, embarrassed caution. He did not recognize the young man, but the other's attire and bearing left no doubt. He was a wizard. Sagres didn't step into the noisy loading area. He tilted his head slightly and motioned for Lupin to speak in a quieter corner. Lupin hesitated, glancing at the overseer, then, with heavy, reluctant steps, moved to stand a few paces from Sagres. He straightened his aching back and watched the stranger cautiously. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse with fatigue. "Mr. Lupin." Sagres' voice was calm, as if the filth and clamor around them meant nothing. "Headmaster Dumbledore sent me to find you." Doubt deepened in Lupin's eyes. "Professor Dumbledore? What does he want with me?" He clutched the dirty hem of his clothes. "Let's talk somewhere else." Sagres glanced at the muggle workers clustered nearby. "To your place," he said coolly. Without protest, Lupin followed the unfamiliar wizard back to his top-floor room. The space was small, but surprisingly clean and tidy. Sagres turned and looked at him. "My name is Sagres Greengrass," he said. "I teach advanced charm theory and practice at Hogwarts." Lupin nodded, curiosity and some skepticism twitching across his face, but he held his questions. "You said Dumbledore sent you?" Sagres didn't answer directly. He reached into his robes and produced 2 letters. One was stamped with the Hogwarts crest. The other was a fresh parchment, the ink still drying. "This one is from the headmaster." He handed Lupin the sealed envelope first. Lupin hesitated, glancing at his filthy hands. "Wait." He turned, drew his wand from an old robe on a hanger, and murmured, "Scourgify." A soft gust passed over him, and the sweat and grime vanished. Only then did he take the clean, white letter with steady fingers. "Headmaster Dumbledore will explain his purpose in the letter," Sagres said, and then held out the second parchment. "This one. Your father asked me to deliver it." "Father?" Lupin's face went pale. He snatched the letters, fingers trembling as he looked between the two and Sagres' composed expression. His breath came quicker. He was eager to read, but restrained, waiting for Sagres to continue. "Professor Dumbledore wishes to invite you to be the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for the new school year at Hogwarts," Sagres said. He paused, then added, "As for your father, he is well, and he misses you very much." Sagres seemed ready to leave, nodding slightly at the gaunt werewolf whose face showed the years of hardship. Before he disappeared, he asked casually, "Mr. Lupin, have you heard of the Blood Moon Alliance?" Lupin looked blank. "What?" Sagres shook his head, and his tone remained flat. He had already performed a subtle legilimency. The answer had been clear. Lupin knew nothing of it. "Nothing," he said, and added, "Since the letters have been delivered, I'll take my leave." Without another word, his figure blurred and then vanished with a soft pop. Lupin stood frozen, as if the sound and the emptied space were a trick. He stared down at the 2 envelopes in his hand, one an unexpected invitation from the man he respected most, the other from the father he worried about nightly. For a moment, the clamor of the docks fell away. He trembled as he opened them and began to read. After leaving Lupin's tidy room, Sagres did not linger. He had accepted Dumbledore's commission and moved with purpose. He apparated north, to the infamous stretch of sea where the fortress of Azkaban sat on black reefs like a tombstone. Cold gales and the sharp salt tang of the sea slashed his face. Dementors drifted between the towers, bringing a hollowing chill. Sagres raised a hand, and several pale fire crows burst from his sleeve to circle him. The Dementors retreated from their light. This trip had no ministry authorization, but entering Azkaban was not difficult for him. He had been imprisoned there once before and had inspected it several times before that. He went straight to Sirius Black's cell. The stone was filthy. Desperate scratches covered the walls. Sagres' gaze swept over every inch of floor and iron bar. There was nothing obvious. He drew his wand and spoke softly. "Footprint reveal." Footprints flared across the floor, layers upon layers of messy, overlapping prints. He crouched to study them, but the tangle was too dense to isolate anything belonging to a single person. He searched for magical residue, but Azkaban itself was a seething source of magical pollution. Chaotic dark arts traces swallowed any clear signature. There were no signs of forced entry and no leftover apparition energies. It was as if Black had evaporated out of his cell into thin air. Sagres stood there a long while, brows knit. The situation was illogical. Even the most skilled wizard would find it almost impossible to leave Azkaban quietly. Unless, he thought, Sirius had used something everyone missed, or something no one could understand. He felt the prison's anti-apparition wards. A sharper question formed in his mind. Why had Sirius Black waited more than 10 years of torment to escape? Had he been unable to before? Or, like Sagres had once been, had he spent that time in Azkaban for some other, unknown purpose? 180, the first half of Professor Lupin's life. Professor Lupin's early life. More than 30 years ago, Lyle Lupin was still working at the Ministry of Magic. As a juror in a murder trial where a werewolf was the main suspect, he argued repeatedly for the man's detention and for a careful investigation. His insistence was met with impatience. The other jurors just wanted the trial finished and their pay. Werewolves were taboo, treated like a plague, and no one wanted to provoke them or be involved. At that time, the wizarding world had no reliable answer to lycanthropy. The wolfsbane potion had not yet been developed, and once someone was marked as a werewolf, recovery was unthinkable. Lyle believed that with all his heart. In the dock, he accused the defendant outright. The man's performance of innocence was an act, and he was very likely the killer. Werewolves, he said, were dangerous and soulless beasts. They should be hunted and imprisoned. But the charge disappeared under the refrain of insufficient evidence. The accused used his superior acting to convince the jurors, and through their negligence, he walked out of the courtroom. Terrifyingly, the moment he stepped beyond the ministry doors, he turned and murdered the official escorting him, then vanished into the night. A few nights later, on a full moon, 4-year-old Remus Lupin woke to the sound of shattering glass as Fenrir Greyback crashed through his bedroom window. The child's screams seared the house. The werewolf's vicious attack buried its mark into Remus's flesh. Lyle arrived in time to cast a few sharp spells that drove the beast away, but it was too late. In the moonlight, his son's small body was ravaged by bone-deep wounds. Lyle felt his heart drop into an ice abyss. He understood then, with a clarity that left no room for hope, that every full moon from that night on would risk tearing the boy apart as he became a thing the rest of the world would revile and hunt. Their life plunged into a darkness not unlike that of Muggle families afflicted by incurable illness. Work became impossible. Their savings dwindled. Remus was hidden away while his parents hunted desperately for ancient cures and folk remedies to break the curse, each small hope flaring and dying into deeper despair. Neighbors' stares felt like thorns. Whispers followed them from street to street. They took to moving constantly, fleeing from one remote town to another. Remus's childhood was inked with pain and solitude. Still, he was not left untrained. Under his father's strict guidance, he learned more magic than most children his age, and under his mother's warm, gentle care, he grew well-read, polite, and modest. When Remus was 11, a turning point arrived. Professor Albus Dumbledore personally found the shabby wooden house where they were hiding and offered the family help. he arranged for Remus to attend Hogwarts. For the first time in many years, a dawn of stability pierced their long-standing gloom. Lyle Lupin's family began slowly to live a steadier life. The brown-haired boy smiling in the photograph had long since been tempered by the full moon's curse into a worn adult wizard. After leaving Hogwarts, he drifted, rootless, unable to settle. Lyle knew how hard his son had it. His letters, written on the cheapest scraps of parchment, were filled with tired reassurance. Every line carried an exhausted steadiness, and between the words, a painful, careful distance. He called Remus home again and again, if only for a visit. Remus refused. He was afraid of the bestial madness that seized him on the full moon, afraid it might spiral beyond his control and bring ruin to his aging parents. His condition was a stigma that branded him and shut him out of normal life. A steady, respectable job was a fantasy. He scraped by on low-paid temporary work, doing what he could to survive.